Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So today I wanted to talk about, kind of related to a recent discussion about trying to get, watch podcast playback, and I did a blog post this week basically saying, like, here's what we need to do this. And I kind of wanted to talk about the process of trying to affect change with Apple and their products and their stores and everything else. And this takes a lot of different forms. I think that the first thing I wanted to talk about is how to know what you can and can't change. If you're going to try to get something done at Apple, or try to get a bug fixed, or try to get a feature done, or try to get some policy changed, it helps to know the company well enough to know basically what fights aren't worth fighting, and what's not worth your effort, and what is. If you want to get bugs fixed, or get API changes to some degree, that stuff is usually possible. Those are fights worth fighting. A lot of people try to get unfair or arguable App Store rejections overturned. I think it is worth challenging unfair or arguable App Store rejections sometimes. Unfair to me means that the rules were not applied correctly or maybe consistently with other apps. Unfair does not mean you disagree with the rules. That's a different situation. So if you've been rejected for some way that you think is actually unfair, like the rules were not applied correctly, that is usually worth filing the appeal. And if that doesn't work, then maybe going public with it. As for arguable App Store rejections, that's very broad. That could be a lot of things. If you keep hitting rules that are arguable, maybe you should rethink what kind of apps you're trying to make, because generally I recommend that you don't build a business or attempt to build a business on living on the edge of a rule. If you stay away from the edges of the rules or the vagaries or the exact interpretations of certain rules, you're generally going to be happier, and it's going to be easier to do business both immediately and going forward. So those are generally the things that generally you can affect: bugs, APIs, and bad App Store rejections. And what you can change can take a number of different forms. You can obviously with App Store rejections you can do the private appeal, which I definitely recommend you do first. Those appeals often work. I've heard a lot of stories from friends and other developers who have appealed things, and they do get overturned. What's your experience with that?
I have many experiences with that, and in general, I would say that is usually we can come to some understanding. Often the sort of I think that Apple appreciates the working it through with them first, in that sense of I've dealt with a variety of rejections for a variety of reasons, and I think the impression I've gotten is that you get farther by not running to the press, not trying to make a big fuss. Maybe that is the final straw, that you do down the road, but that initially you work with them, and you work with them patiently, and with politeness and respect, and you work through it, because typically they're coming at it's the issue, unless you're just doing something wild and off the reservation, usually there is some sticking point that they're stuck on that you have to work out a way to work around. That there may be a small change that you can make to your app that will affect that change. And by doing, if you handle that in a respectful way, that in my experience, that sort of the appeal process and working those channels directly will often get you somewhere. Sometimes it may not be exactly where you would like to be. Sometimes you'll end up having to make changes to your app that may limit its functionality or make you feel like you've lost a competitive edge or something. But by and large, that process does work. And while it can be, frustrating in the moment, and, I've certainly been very emotional in the moment, when I work on something for months and you submit it and then, it gets rejected for a reason that you don't agree with, that's a very emotional thing, but it does ultimately, work through. And just being respectful, making sure you're understanding the subtext around what they're saying, I think, is something that I found to also be helpful. That often, like, they're saying one thing, and which is correct, but it's because of something else. Like, there's an underlying reason that you're trying to find, and if the better you can try to understand that, or ask probing questions around that, the better you're able to make a change. Because usually, what I've ended up happening is it's unlikely that they'll be like, oh, actually, yeah, we made a mistake. You're fine now. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. In my experience, usually it's a more likely scenario is, here's this small change that I can say, like, if I did this, would it be okay then? And they often says, well, we can't pre-approve it, but that's heading in the right direction. And then I make a change, I resubmit, and then everything's fine. But it does work. Like, I've gone through that process enough times, and gotten apps that were rejected, ultimately approved, often with relatively minor changes. So it does work, and it's something that I would encourage you to do, and it's definitely the place to start. Thankfully, I've very rarely, if ever, had to sort of try to make a big fuss to get something happen, because it's sort of you're going all in at that point. Like, it's either going to work or it doesn't. And even if it does work, you're putting your app in kind of an awkward situation for its future going forward. If it was ultimately accepted, but not under the best circumstances, like, what does that mean in 6 months when you submit a big update and you're kind of doubling down on the features that were questionable to start with? So that's certainly my experience, and it works, and it's an encouraging process that's gotten a lot better than when it back 8 years ago, when things were a much more like, I don't think on Apple's side they had quite dialed in their process there to the degree they have now, and so
that's generous.
It works better now.
Yeah, it's way better now. All right, so those are kind of the things that you can affect change with. There's also a lot of things that you can't really affect change, and that your effort is probably wasted, and that might even annoy Apple if you do it. And this includes things like trying to get major App Store policies or business rules changed, or get exceptions for yourself. This is things like getting around the 30% cut for in-app purchases, or subscriptions, or things like that. This also includes, like, campaigning for major technical changes they're very unlikely to do. So things like allowing all iOS apps to run in the background indefinitely. Like, if you just want to have, like, a persistent daemon running on iOS, like, that's never going to happen. They're never going to allow that. Also, things that combine both of these, like both App Store policy and major technical things, like allowing side loading of iOS apps. That's probably never going to happen either. Like, I respect people who try to make that case to Apple, but I think it's futile. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And also, kind of obvious things, like anything that could be potentially abused. Like, even if you have good intentions on something you want to be able to do, you have to think about what could a bad actor do with that same ability. So anything that could be abused for privacy violations is a big one. So things like access to restricted hardware, things like Face ID, Touch ID, secure enclave stuff, access to like the restricted privacy sensitive APIs like location or microphone without prompting the user, stuff like that. Like, if you need those things, you're going to have a hard time, and that's probably not a great way to spend any amount of effort trying to affect change at Apple. And also, there's a big one that's kind of sad, but it's a reality. And that is if you're trying to get bug fixes or API changes for either very old or very low priority APIs or platforms. And so, this would include, low priority platforms in general. I would say things like tvOS is pretty low priority. I would say, unfortunately, most of macOS is pretty low priority. So, if you want some, API enhanced on a low priority platform, you're going to have a hard time doing it. Even a bug fix, if it's not a really critical bug, you might have a hard time even getting anybody to care about that or to have time to work on it. Because, even if you make a great case for some kind of change like this, if nobody's working on that thing, there's no one to fix it. It's not going to happen. A lot of Apple projects will go either completely unstaffed or staffed by like one person who also worked on 17 other things for years. It's like who maintains like Address Book? It's probably like one person who also maintains 6 other frameworks. And even when you have a small staff on a project, they might not have time to do your bug or your enhancement, because every year when Apple does big new headlining features that they market to customers, or they have new hardware that things need to take advantage of or be adapted for, all those like one person or small teams that are working on like, old apps or kind of, less high priority things, they have to adopt those marketing features first. Those will always take priority over like, old enhancements or bug fixes they also want to do. So for a lot of projects at Apple, there's literally not time for much of anything else. Like, so if you file some bug with like, iWork, like iWork is a great example because it has a staff. iWork is staffed, but iWork is involved in so many marketing features every year that it has to adopt or that it has to make sure it works with. So any changes to iOS, changes to like the multitasking, the file picking, document handling, changes to iCloud, collaboration, sharing. Like iWork is involved in all sorts of crazy stuff. And so if you have a feature request or some kind of minor bug in iWork, that's going to take way lower priority than all the crazy marketing stuff they have to do every year just to keep up with Apple's own stuff. So there's a lot of projects at Apple for which like you can file bugs or you can write a nice blog post saying that you wish this obscure bug would be fixed or that you wish this API was different. But if it's a low priority or old API or project, or if its staff is way too busy doing other stuff, you're gonna have a really hard time with that.
And to that end, I think also it's hard for us to have a sense of what the future is going to hold. And because we don't we're at a disadvantage to Apple in the regard that they know what next year's release is going to look like and have a good idea probably of what the next release after that is going to look like. And so if you're filing bugs against frameworks or things that Apple knows they have different plans for in the future, then it's going to become even harder likely for your bug or your issue to be addressed. And maybe, you would, in the best case, it'll be like rolled into the changes they're making, or if they're replacing the framework with something better, or, those types of things may come into play. But it's the awkward thing too of it's easy, like all we see is the end results. And we can't know what's coming in 9 months, whereas Apple does. And so it's entirely possible that a bug comes in for a framework and they're like, yeah, we're not going to fix that because, in 10 months that framework's going away or it's going to be replaced with something better. They're rather going to put their engineering effort into that. And so that can often, it's like we don't, if we file a bug, we can do all the right things, have an example project, show how to reproduce it. It may never get fixed, and the reason why it may never get fixed could be any of the things you were just talking about in terms of staffing. It could just be a question of priorities or the future. It's impossible to know exactly why it happened, and that can sometimes be frustrating, but that's just the reality, I think.
We are sponsored this week by Blue Apron, the #1 recipe delivery service with the freshest ingredients. Blue Apron's mission is to make incredible home cooking accessible to everyone and support a more sustainable food system. They set the highest standards for ingredients, and they're building a community of home chefs. For less than $10 per meal, Blue Apron delivers seasonal recipes along with fresh, high-quality ingredients to make delicious home-cooked meals in 40 minutes or less. See, our show's a little bit shorter than that. That's pretty good. Each meal comes with a step-by-step, easy-to-follow recipe card and pre-portioned ingredients, and they ship the exact amount of each ingredient that the recipe requires, so they are reducing food waste in the process. And Blue Apron's freshness guarantee promises that every ingredient arrives ready to cook or they will make it right. I personally have been a Blue Apron customer with our family for, maybe 2 years now. It's been a while now, even before they were sponsoring any of our shows. And we just love Blue Apron. Their recipes are fantastic. We have really become better chefs as a result of having Blue Apron. It is awesome. We've tried so many new foods, new cuisines, that like things we would never even order in a restaurant that all of a sudden we're cooking. And then they're delicious. And now we go out and we order those things in restaurants. Like it expands your horizons both for food, and also it really does make you a better cook by just having so much more experience. And on nights that we don't have Blue Apron, we make better things now. So you can choose from a variety of new recipes each week, or you can just let their team choose for you and surprise you. You can cook meals like soy-glazed pork and rice cakes with bok choy and marinated green beans, skillet vegetable chili with cornmeal and cheddar drop biscuits, or garlic butter shrimp and corn with green bean salad and roasted purple tomatoes. There is no weekly commitment, so you only get deliveries when you want them. You can cancel them at any time. You can skip some if you're going to be out of town or whatever. It doesn't matter. So check out this week's menu and get 3 free meals with your first purchase, including free shipping, by going to blueapron.com/radar. You will love how great it feels and tastes to create incredible home-cooked meals with Blue Apron. So get started today by going to blueapron.com/radar. Thank you to Blue Apron for supporting this show. Blue Apron, a better way to cook. After all the discussion before of what you can change and what you can't change at Apple, now I want to talk about how you actually do it. The best ways to affect change at Apple. You know, if you're going to be doing something that's actually changeable, how do you do it? So first, as we talked about a little bit earlier, you should start with private methods first. So very first thing with any bug or enhancement is file a radar. And this is a hard thing to do because the radar system it's almost punitive. Like it really is almost abusive. Like in how much effort they want you to invest into filing bug reports, even down to things like making sample projects which they will almost always request for almost anything, even if it doesn't seem to need it, to the point where I almost think it's a delay tactic so they can just close more bugs when people don't do it. But I don't almost think that. I do think that. But anyway, so file a radar first. And the reason why is because Radar it's Apple's bug reporting system, and Radar is how Apple passes things around and prioritizes things internally. So if you later want to write a blog post or email somebody in the company or bother somebody on Twitter who works there or something, if you want to like escalate things further, it really helps to have a Radar number or series of numbers to point them to say, look, this is what I'm talking about. Because then if they actually take up your case, and if they want to prioritize something in the company or forward it to somebody else or get it to the right department or try to convince somebody that this should be prioritized, they are going to do that by passing around Radar numbers to people. And so it really helps a lot if you have a Radar filed. I'm not always the best at this, and usually when they ask for a sample project, I just get mad and just abandon it because I'm like, I'm not going to waste my time doing this. You should fix this bug. But that is the most effective way to do it. And so generally Radar first, and then keep things private first if you can. So obviously with App Store appeals, do the private appeal first before you go public, because most of the time you won't need to go public, and that'll be nice. When you do need to go public, it makes your case a little more defensible to them internally if you can say, if you basically tried to do it privately first. Similar thing with like when you're reporting security vulnerabilities. I feel like, I don't know much about that community, but I think it works in a similar way where it's like you try the private method first, and then if it doesn't work, then you consider going public. I don't know. Do you file radars and stuff and for all your stuff, or do you just work it out yourself? How do you do that?
So I've filed a great many radars over the years, and I think radars tend to take different forms. Like some of my radars are just straight up bug reports. Like I'm just saying, I use this API in a way that it is documented that it should work, and it doesn't. And like those ones are relatively straightforward, and that's sort of the one side. And the other side of the radars that I file tend to be, and I write them this way actually now. I write them, they're almost just letters. Like they're like open letters to Apple saying, or like I guess closed letters to Apple saying,
I believe they're just called letters.
Yeah, it's like, here's this thing that like, hi, I make these apps. These are this is something that I'd like to be able to do with them that a current API can't do. And I try and give as much context and just sort of, I try to flesh out not just like what I want, like not just the technical, like I wish this API would do X, Y, Z, but I try and provide like real world situations and examples as to why. Sometimes it's like, he even like, here's a link to my app, like here you can go see where this would fit in, like to try and build a case. Because as best I can understand, and I know several friends who work at Apple, like I know a lot of people there, the impression I get is that like Radar is this funny thing because we see this very kind of sort of terse, opaque thing on the outside where we put things in and then we'll either get, it's flagged as duplicate or nothing will happen at all for a long period of time. But internally with Apple, they have a whole other sort of discussions and threads and things that are going on around, the Radar that I filed that is happening internally. And that is the part that I'm trying to, provide as much information as I can to make engineers within Apple's case or lives easier. Because the reality is, with almost any change that we want, there's probably going to be someone at Apple who thinks, yeah, this is a good idea. There might be other people who think that's not such a great idea, and they're going to be having, with any engineering choice, there's usually, there's benefits and disadvantages, and it can. They may be thinking even in a broader sense, because they have to not just think of your specific case, but they need to think of the worst case of someone else using this API. But they're having this discussion internally, and all I'm really trying to do is, if there is somebody who is going to be advocating for the change that I want to provide that person with all of the as much as I can in terms of support and evidence to make that change happen. And so I just write as much of this as I can, and it can feel a bit funny in the sense that the radar system is all about what was the expected result and what did happen, and it's obviously structured for technical reports. But I find if I'm filing an enhancement request, that's what I do. It's so hard to know the degree to which that is actually effective, but it's just what I've sort of gotten comfortable with doing, and I've never heard anything bad about it in terms of I've never had them closed as irrelevant or poorly or incomplete or written or something like that. It seems like it's just a mechanism by which you can have private communication with Apple that someone inside of engineering will actually look at, and especially also I think in communication, if functionally the way the developer relations system works is we can file a radar, and then there's a collection of evangelists. All of essentially the developer relations team is there to interact with developers personally. So usually what I will end up doing is I'll file a radar, sort of put that out there, and then depending on what the nature of the the enhancement request is, if I know the evangelist who would most closely fit that, I'll reach out to them and I'll say, hey, here's this thing that I filed, here's the reason why I'm asking it. If you have any questions or things, please let me know. And, sort of in the same way that you may, it's you submit your resume on the system, and then you also may, follow up with an email to a recruiter or something. You hit it in both ways just to make it that much more likely that someone's going to look at it. And they may disagree with it. They may ignore it. It may not end up being effective, but at least someone has looked at it and they've made an active decision to not do it.
Also, the timing of when you file bugs or when you go public with things matters a lot with Apple, because Apple is a company full of human beings, and they're on a tight schedule, and they all have more things on their plate than they have time to do. But the good thing is we know their schedule. Their schedule matches the release schedule of their products and their operating systems, so we know the schedule, so we can use it to our advantage. So generally, if you file a bug or you bring up a public thing at a time when they're really busy doing other stuff, it's going to get lost in the shuffle, or it's more likely to get lost in the shuffle. So the best time to file bugs is when they are actively looking for bugs ravenously, and that is early betas. Right after WWDC, when you get those betas and you're trying out the new stuff, they are looking very closely at bugs people are filing. So if you want things to happen, that's the time to do it. It's the code is open, it's being worked on. That's the time when they can allocate lots of their own time to looking at your bugs and considering them. The worst time to file bugs or to make requests in public is probably right before WWDC. Because they are in a massive crunch time every year trying to get stuff done for those first betas, for those first builds, and anything you try to have them do during that time that they don't have to do is going to get dropped on the floor because they're way too busy. Also, similarly, when it's right before the GMs come out in the fall, when there's about to be new hardware released, they have no time to consider your enhancement request then. The OS is basically done at that point. That's a terrible time to do it. A good time to do it also, besides the early betas, is I would say the very beginning of the year, January through March maybe, because usually they're doing a kind of an intermediary release cycles, like the 0.2s or 0.3s of the OSs. It's kind of a quieter time. It's a time when they might have more time to allocate towards improvements rather than just core features. I also want to spend a quick moment talking about tone and framing when you go public. So if you're going to write a blog post, or you're going to have, any kind of public, outing of what Apple is doing or not doing, or what you want them to do.
If you're going to become the elephant in the room, say.
Yes, it helps to the way you frame it, and this actually should also probably apply to the way you write bug reports too. The framing is very important. You want to instead of just saying like, "I want this to be fixed." Well, that's you need to frame it as, here's why it helps Apple users and developers, and they care about them in that order. Developers are really last in that trio. Like, you need to tell them why Apple needs to do this and why that will benefit Apple's customers or the users of your software. Like, that's what you need to tell them. And what you as a developer need is really low on the list, because if you tell them something that will benefit Apple, your chances are better. And the tone that you use in the wording and just everything, headlines, titles, the best way to do, Apple is, again, this is a company full of people. I have found that culturally, many of the people there are pretty sensitive to the tone with which requests and especially complaints are made. The best thing you can do is to basically remain factual, state the facts as neutrally as you can. Any request or criticism that you're making of them, be civil and be constructive as much as possible. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to give them a reason to disregard you as just being mean or just being a jerk or being unreasonable. You want to give you want to say, here's the facts, here's what we need, or here's what I need, or here's what happened, and here's what I think should happen. And it's also important not to, they're very sensitive about this, not to put words in their mouth or not to ascribe motivations to Apple. There was a kerfuffle last year with a developer where like he recorded a conversation with Apple on the phone, like without their permission, like that. That's something you shouldn't. Don't do that, and don't ascribe motivations to Apple. Like, Apple did this because they hate me, or because they're being mean, or because they don't want this kind of app. Like, unless they told you that in some kind of public way, like, don't ascribe motivations or malice to Apple. Just keep it factual, keep it neutral, and I mean, obviously this goes for a lot of communication in the adult world. Like, this is what you should do in general. But yeah, like, if you keep it factual, neutral, and constructive, it increases your chances that you're going to be taken seriously, and that will improve your chances of getting done what you actually want to get done.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, like, that's just good advice for life, probably. But it's like it's understanding that I think it's easy to think of Apple as a faceless entity, right? That it's like, that doesn't have feelings, that doesn't have emotions, that is just this cold machine that, takes in code and outputs money. Like that, but that's not the reality. Like, it is, you are ultimately trying to, if you have a change that you'd like to affect, you are trying to convince people to do that. And the best way to affect people is to, be respectful of them and to be presenting your arguments in ways that is hopefully going to ultimately make them look good, that is going to, make their life better in some way. And you're going to have way more luck with that than just yelling and screaming and throwing a fit, because that's not going to help anything. Like, that doesn't help if you're a 2-year-old, and it's definitely not going to help in trying to affect change into a massive, billion-dollar company.
Exactly, because anything you are arguing, as you said earlier, you are providing ammo for an internal discussion. You want your side of the argument to win internally. And so if you make a really good case, people inside can use that to win arguments, to affect change, to do what you want. So it really helps a lot that you make the best case possible, and that you choose things wisely to even argue about in the first place. And when you do it right, play by their system, play by their rules, and play by general adult civility rules, and you will have much better chances of succeeding. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Best of luck with everybody with your affecting changes efforts, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.